Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your cell phones are turned off? So welcome to the College of the Atlantic. My name is Darren Collins, and I'm the president here at COA. There's going to be a full moon rising over Frenchman Bay, and maybe a storm coming up, so we're perfectly situated to kissing the moon and exploring the work of Winslow Homer. Dr. John Wilmerding is with us tonight, and he's the Christopher Binion Seraphim Professor Emeritus at Princeton. As a scholar and writer, as a curator, as a teacher, as a collector, as a philanthropist, where American art is concerned, John is in a class by himself. No one has brought those elements together to help the world come to understand American art more than John. No one. John approaches writing like a master art conservator, a hack conservator, will carelessly overclean and then be forced to embellish and retouch a painting. But a master with skill and intuition opens just a small window and removes just enough clutter to reveal truth. And in writing history, John clarifies just enough to expose the truth about art, about the artist, and about the context. With a family that includes names like Havemeyer and Webb, John is blessed with a collector's gene. In 1960, a few months before submitting his senior thesis at Harvard on Fitzhugh Lane, John purchased his first painting by no other than Lane himself. And I think this goes to show that Wilmerding knows what he likes, and he deeply understands what he likes. He applied that same intuition and same knowledge when acquiring Sparrow Hall, a painting from Winslow Homer's 2 years in Cullercoats, England, a pivotal period for the artist where he discovered the forces in the world that make us all feel a little bit smaller. After 12 years of teaching, writing, and collecting on the Dartmouth faculty, John joined the National Gallery of Art as a senior curator in 1977. John's curatorial debut was American Light, a look into the luminous movement that made Frederick Church and Martin Heed centerpieces of our American intellectual tradition. John ended his decade-long curatorial career at the National Gallery, again with a show of none other than Fitzhugh Lane, and then returned to teaching at Princeton. 10 years after John's appointment at Princeton, he joined us here as a trustee at the College of the Atlantic. He's helped the college institutionally and has helped me individually as we strengthen the arts across our curriculum. I'd say he's always been something of a human ecologist. From his earliest days at Harvard, he brought his passion for literature and writing and art together, crossing disciplines to create new knowledge. And that interdisciplinary approach is a defining characteristic of human ecology and of John's brilliance. In 2004, Wilmerding gifted his American collection to the National Gallery of Art, 51 paintings from 26 artists. I don't know the art world deeply, but it must be rare for someone to possess the brilliance, the master collector's knowledge and intuition, and such a powerful philanthropic impulse. That philanthropy and his lifelong commitment to American art were leveraged this April when the Walton Family Foundation made a $10 million gift to the National Gallery in John's name. J. Carter Brown once called John the Grand Master of American art history. I can't improve on that. Please welcome the Grand Master of American art history, John Wilmerding.
That was so good, I want you to write my obituary. I'm going to talk about Winslow Homer, a project, artist I've worked on for, 30, 40 years, a couple of books and a number of exhibitions. This particular talk which I've called Winslow Homer in his art. I'm interested in how he projects himself, first through his signatures. I wrote a book 10 years ago called Signs of the Artist, Signatures and Self-Expression in American Painting. And I devoted in that, I think, half a chapter to Homer. And so my ideas go back to that, and as I've thought about it since, I've tried to push the analysis a little bit further, my argument a little bit along the line, to a point I have to admit tonight in advance that partly what I'm going to be doing is speculation. And it's speculation that may disturb some of you. You may not believe it, and you may not like it. So I'm just giving you, as the television people say, an early warning. But I thought the argument I'm about to present, or at least the line of thinking, was worth trying out. So this is, in a sense, a kind of experiment. What it took me back to was the fact I realized early on that Homer painted signatures in at least 2 or 3 dozen different ways. Sometimes yes initials, sometimes W. Homer, sometimes just Homer, sometimes Winslow Homer, and with different, as you'll see in a couple of cases, it's going to be hard to see the details, but in some instances he played with the typography, the very shape of his letters, so that often the bar on the W at the beginning of his name would project out, or the R at the end of it would curve outward. It just struck me how an artist was so interested not in being a chameleon, but in somehow adopting the way, how he wanted to, as it were, place himself in the picture. And many of these images, many of these signatures, as you'll see, are actually in what's called the fictive space. They're of course painted on the surface of the canvas or inscribed in the print, but illusionistically they look as if they were inscribed on some object or some piece of the landscape within the painting itself. And the more I thought about it, particularly as the career moves on and in a way becomes more serious, where at first my sense is these signatures are just rather playful. They're sort of technical challenges, how to be clever about, as it were, inserting yourself into the work. And again, to anticipate my argument, by the time we get to mid-career and some of the great paintings of particularly the 1890s onward, his mature career, when the great themes of life and death become his subject, I think there's a subtle transformation, as I hope to show you, to suggest that he was investing himself or associating himself in an emotional way, a psychological way, and perhaps other ways with the interior, the object, or whatever it might be within the canvas. You'll see that in a moment. So I just start, well, I should, I guess, even though we all know his work, a quick capsule of his biography. Born 1836 in Boston, goes to day school in Cambridge, where his family then lived, through the local schools, a local high school, and then showing some talent. His mother actually was a fairly good watercolorist and introduced him to the world of making art, and I think that was a significant memory for him. I'll come back to that, as you'll see later. And his father, realizing his talent, arranged for him to go in and work for a lithographer, Bufford Lithography Shop in Boston, then one of the most prominent printing shops in Boston, where Lane actually had trained before him. And so Homer goes in, learns the graphic arts, 2 of which you see here among his early examples. And I've always thought this graphic training was absolutely critical for his later style. That is to say, if you work in black and white, it teaches you to understand outline, to understand contour. It it teaches you to try and model with gradations between the dark and the light. So the fundamentals of graphic arts, even when he later turns to color in oil paint and watercolor, and that sense of design, that sense of compositional organization sticks with him for the rest of his career. Showing talent, he gets early jobs with some of the local lithography magazines, some of the popular titles of the day, and fairly soon with Harper's Magazine in New York, begins to print some of his work. He does images of Harvard College, early images of the Boston Common, of the downtown waterfront. These begin to show his sort of early competence and confidence. What you have here are two works after he was really well established. I think on turning the age 21, he said to his father he would never work for anybody ever again. He wanted to be his own master. He would take assignments regularly now from the 1850s through the Civil War and into the early 70s, would take regular paid assignments from Harper's, but it was on his terms. And so there's a kind of independence struck early on, wanting to be, as it were, his own artist. He, during the Civil War, is hired by Harper's and invited to come to New York and be, in a sense, an art correspondent for the front. And one of the images dating from that early period is the sharpshooter you see there on the right-hand screen, one of his few Civil War images showing, the new manner of warfare, the sharpshooter, the surprise attack and assault, very dangerous and much feared category of fighting in the Civil War. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Prior to that, the one on the left, as you can see, is an ice skating scene. You clearly can't read the caption, but it's set in Central Park in New York. He moves from Boston down to New York and does a series of these sort of pleasant genre scenes, particularly park scenes. Skating he came to love. This is one of the first, and you'll see signatures, or it'll be hard to see them, but I will try and show you where they are. He starts playing with his signature early on. This one is a particular delight. You can see some scratches here. What he has done is signed his name as if the skater has carved it into the ice. It's as I say, it's clever, but it's an absolute delight. And it's the first index, as I say, of Homer wanting to associate, and whether it's him skating and leaving his mark. There are other cases, for example, of Gloucester beach scenes where he has a woman with an umbrella scratching his initials into the sand on the beach. This wonderful, playful kind of approach, which is part of this early work before the Civil War, before he takes on his, as it were, his first serious subjects. Again, the sharpshooter, it's hard to see where it is. I can tell you, however, and this is one reason to go look at the real prints or very good reproductions, he signed his full name, Homer, not W, but Homer, right there in the crotch of the tree trunk. I guess I want to argue as if he himself were up there in the tree with the sharpshooter. In other words, Homer is associated, he's not just observing what's going on the battlefields of Virginia, and he did go to the front. Interestingly, and I guess not surprisingly, he painted almost wood engraved very few battle scenes, and my guess is trying to depict in print certainly, let alone photography, figures in motion was extremely difficult. And so what's interesting, of course, just from a stylistic point of view, is the elevated view that you have here, the rather clean graphic sense, concentrating on the sharpshooter himself, the tree limbs, and so forth. But as I say, what's particularly interesting is the signature there, as if Homer, as I say, wanted to place himself also observing from that peculiar point of view. After the war is over, like many artists, he was attracted to Paris. So in 1866, 67, he goes on his first of 2 European trips out of the country. He is in Paris now, goes, as you can see from this very image, goes to the Louvre, as most artists did. We suspect this is the period, now this is a critical moment in Paris, certainly for Impressionism. If one thinks of early Manet, Olympia, the great Jean Racines, those artists also making prints. It was said at the World's Fair, the exposition of 1867 or 8, the first Japanese prints were shown in Paris. If that were so, it was Homer's first exposure to an art form he would return to later on. So it's a crucial period. So modernism and the idea of modernity in Paris, Homer seems to have absorbed. He certainly did the obligatory trip into the Louvre to copy and look at the old masters. And what he shows us here, as you can tell, is the Grand Gallery, the central gallery of the Louvre. And what are we looking at but a woman actually in the mode of copying, another one with her palette contemplating this. She's looking at, I've forgotten, at a Spanish painting back here. What, again, you probably can't make out, except that it's a kind of smudge here, is that his signature here, and this should now come as no surprise, is a pair of initials, WH, and he has signed the woman's copy. So now Homer, and there are a number of cases, now Homer is interested not just, of course, in being present as a student in the Louvre, looking at copies, but being one himself, but playing with the very idea, as it were, of literacy, of the word on a page, the word on a blackboard, as we'll see. And this idea, the sort of double entendre of looking at something visual that is also literary, is a playfulness that also will stick with him. Back now after Paris, he settles out in Gloucester, Massachusetts, at least spends his first full summer there in 1873. And it's at that moment when he really reaches the pinnacle of his graphic achievement. There are a few later etchings that he does, but it's at this moment he now has the confidence to start painting watercolor and within a year or two, oil paintings. So it's a real transitional moment. Many of these prints, particularly in 1873, are related to drawings, are related to watercolors, and are related to oil paintings. And it's a very complicated shifting back and forth as he experiments in these various media. Printmaking, watercolor, which is extremely difficult to do with its quickness, its transparency, and then the facility of oil painting. And so you're beginning to see him explore the possibilities of each of those media. In any case, the summer of 1873 spends in Gloucester. The background of this picture that shows, called Shipbuilders, the men in the background, the boys shipbuilding, as it were, in the foreground, another typical kind of Homer device where he has similar activities going on at two stages of life. The boys will become men and eventually build the grand hulls going out to fish and trade from the New England coast. So where is his signature here? I think this is one you may be able to read a little more clearly. He's signed it in his initials here as if, again, it has been carved into the flat cut plane of this log that has, of course, been hewn, being prepared ultimately to be pulled into and used as part of the construction of vessels in the background. So the eye, just through these graphic devices, is led from the foreground to the background, to boys playing with sailboats, at leisure, at play, a kind of innocent world of game playing, to big men, to big boys who are going to not only construct on a larger scale, but go out into the world at large. So there's a little narrative here which was appropriate for magazine publication. These were often accompanied by poems or little narratives in Harper's Magazine, for whom he was printing most of these. Family magazine, so you had the visual and the verbal side by side. But I love the fact, as I say, that he's in this case illusionistically, that is to say, in the receding plane of the piece of the log there, has actually illusionistically carved his initials. This pair is also among the early 70s, where he's on the Gloucester shoreline doing a promenade. Oh, and here's the one I was just mentioning. You can see quite clearly here a Gloucester scene with everybody all dressed up on a summer's day, and his initials presumably having just been cut in the wet sand, W.H. So here, we begin to think of Homer having stood there himself. He was part of this entourage, enjoying the social exchange going on. A little harder to see is sand swallows, the young boys raiding a swallow's nest, looking for eggs. Presumably this boy has already got one sliding down. So where is Homer here? Well, you can't make it out because it's very clever. WH in the lower right, and it's not just WH, he's curved the W, curved the H, so it looks like, of course, the strands of the daisies and the weeds that are growing up just above it. So over and over, I don't want to keep repeating here, over and over again, and this is wonderful, playful, and as I say, really often in some cases, technically quite challenging examples. When he does begin painting, that experimentation continues, both in cleverness of placement, device, and so forth. So that another Marblehead beach scene where figures of the women have been swimming and are now drying out their clothing and her hair. This wonderful little scared dog, whether by the shadow or the woman leaning over, we don't know. But what I find interesting is, the dog's tail has been curved behind him. And whether you can make it out, the Winslow Homer here, the W has this wonderful arch form that in a sense repeats the curved form of the dog, and even picks up the arc of the woman's head. So there's a clear, again, in the pigment itself, the brown and the brown of the dog. We'll see this take on dramatic terms in a moment. But this idea, as I say, of somehow placing himself through the surrogacy of his signature. In the White Mountains, he travels into the New Hampshire White Mountains. Again, this is a painting, I think, of the later 60s. And this is certainly Homer himself. It's one of the few self-portraits, as it were, even though barely recognizable. There are two ways we know that it is Homer. You may not be able to make out, but just silhouetting against the cloud there in the background is his waxed mustache. Secondly, and more conclusively, if you were to look closely at the backpack here in the foreground, in bold letters he has painted W. Homer. So that, once more, as I say, now there's this double entendre of the real figure, the real artist who's, as it were, outside the canvas, looking at himself painting, who is in turn painting the landscape beyond. This playfulness, as I say, of what is real and what is seen, and he's at the center of it. he does a number of school scenes of young women teaching. And again, it's a very interesting, important subject after the Civil War, particularly with so many men of teaching age slaughtered on the battlefields of Antietam, Gettysburg, etc. Really, there was a whole missing generation. There were the boys who were about to grow up, and there were the old men, perhaps, who survived. But the middle generation of fathers and brothers were gone. And so, just from a social point of view, women were brought into the workforce. And they, as you might expect, were a very humane influence in, for example, turning the tide against corporal punishment, hitting children who were unruly. So Homer becomes fascinated, and he himself now, I think, is in his, just approaching his early 30s. He's at that extraordinary transitional moment between the end of youth and the beginning of manhood. And so he's interested on back and forth between the young school children's life and, as it were, the sense of thought that goes with the teacher here and here, both isolated against a very strong rectangle of the blackboard. And again, you see when I talked about his graphic sensibility, the composition here, it's almost like an early Mark Rothko, these rectangles of grays. Of course, that in itself, the monochromy goes back to printmaking. But the same token here, the way he's consciously made you aware of the three rectangular panels of window, blackboard, and window, and then the subdivisions into smaller rectangles. The play and perspective of the benches lined against the rectangular walls, to be sure, in perspective, and then the three-dimensional play of the desk and the legs that hold it up. This wonderful, as I say, compositional sense of design in 2 and 3 dimensions that tie these compositions all together. Here should, again, be fairly obvious that his signature Winslow Homer has been scratched into the wood bench as if a naughty child, some youth, bored youth, like this kid here, and there were several scenes that he was fascinated with, as I say, this up-to-date, new kind of schooling. These were set in the landscape of upstate New York, and the famous Snap the Whip in the Metropolitan Collection takes place outside this school setting. So I think he's also begun to be interested between inside and outside. That's another subject to pursue. But it's part of this whole series, and of course, again, the blackboard, the teacher, is about learning. It's not just about learning to paint, as we saw with the White Mountain picture, but it's students learning to write, to read. So here you have forms that are geometry, almost like a sort of basic graffiti that suggests musical notations, that suggest basic language, that suggest even sort of art forms. So there, the signatures, I say, inscribed, and there's a wonderful mate to this picture of the red schoolhouse. And a young boy, and you just assume that he's, quote, a good, bad boy, has taken his brush and like a graffiti artist, is scratching is painting on the side of the schoolhouse, WH. Here, like the Louvre picture, you can certainly see the white line, Winslow Homer, in block letters right here at the bottom. And again, I think it's this subtlety of Homer not only being in the subject, but these layers of looking, these layers of perception about word and image within the image, strengthened, as I say, by this wonderful sense of composition. After a second trip to England, President Collins mentioned this, the second trip to England in 1881, he had by this point mastered what I call this kind of genre style that was popular at mid-century. One thinks of William Sidney Mount, George Caleb Bingham, the popular everyday life. Homer clearly had mastered this. He'd also mastered both the medium of watercolor and the medium of oil. What does an artist do, at midlife in his now early 40s? And we're not entirely sure why he went to England as opposed to Europe this time. And moreover, except for one watercolor he did passing through London of the Houses of Parliament, he went to the north coast, to Tynemouth, near Cullercoats, and painted now dramatic sea scenes of hardy fisherwomen. It's no longer the youthful figure. As he himself had aged, he now turns to the seriousness of adulthood. And he paints these extraordinarily sturdy fisherwomen fighting the wind to carry the catch, the men going out to sea. Homer's whole exposure, as it were, to the difficulties of work, to the difficulties of nature, to trying to make a living. Now, in this period, the germs of the great themes of his later career, the themes ultimately of life and death itself, are forged in this period. He makes a few etchings. He paints almost, except for one or two oils, he paints almost exclusively in watercolor, as if he wants to push to the limit now the possibilities of the medium, its transparency, translucency, its sense of spontaneity. Extraordinary works that now carry his watercolor medium even further. When he returns now, he now begins to take up these really dramatic themes. He moves because his family already had bought a house out on the point at Prouts Neck, Maine, decides that he will now make the Maine coast his lifelong residence. He would travel in the winter months to the Bahamas, to Florida. In the summer months, he would go to the Adirondacks or to Canada to fish, to hunt. But now Prouts Neck becomes his basis. He buys what was the carriage house for the main house of the Homer family, now inhabited by his older brother Charles and Charles's wife. Homer liked the idea of owning the carriage house, which he then took over and promptly expanded to add his studio. It's, as many of you probably know, it's now been brilliantly restored to what it looked like around 1900 when Homer's greatest works were painted there. And it was literally right on the edge of the cliffs. And you see it here on the left. Here is the house of the family, the Ark, and over a short distance is Homer's studio. And one of the things he'd added on, which is very clear in this painting, is what I think of as a paintings balcony. And if you go there today, you step out on that balcony and you immediately look at this panorama of rock and water, the subject matter that would be the basis for his great explorations of a kind of Darwinian play between water and rock. The elemental forces of nature were right there within yards in front of him. So that balcony, it seems to me, very important. I just find it fascinating, and again, makes sense, that in painting this scene called The Artist Studio in an Afternoon Fog, it's almost like an eclipse. There's a play of obscurity here. Again, look now, this is in the 1880s. It's a long way from the early Gloucester prints, and yet here again, he returns periodically to monochromy. This is almost all grays, browns, tans, highlight of white in the moon. But I think, as I say, it's not only a phenomenon of an afternoon fog, it's also something more mysterious. And the fact that his house and his place of painting is at the dead center of the composition, suggests that this is also a kind of self-portrait. Well, in this case, a self-portrait, that is to say, of his life. And of course, in the foreground, you can make out Winslow Homer has been painted on the rocks in the foreground. And there are many other cases where he'll angle the signature to follow the diagonal of the rock ledges themselves. So I've just been building this case now up to this point. We come now to one of the great, great works in his career, one of the most dramatic, most challenging in many ways, and it's here that my speculation begins. But first, what does it come from? Almost certainly, Japanese prints are behind this play of almost abstracted forms, dark against light, the conscious silhouette, the diagonal silhouette of the fox versus the crows above, all these subtle diagonals, and at the same time, in a way, the compression of space. This was a typical way of Japanese print thinking, the plays of asymmetry, of foreground, background, of figure versus landscape. So I think that's partly in mind here that explains something of the simplicity of this work. The Proutsneff cliffs and the waves breaking are there in the background. As you explore it, of course, in this great paintings in the Pennsylvania Academy, it's one of those pictures one wants to return to over and over again. I can't take credit for pointing out this signature or beginning to think about it, but it's haunted me, and I just want to push now the button and move there. First of all, what have we got? We've got the fox trying to run through the snow, and as I say, trying to, because as you can see, its hind legs have been caught in the snow, and it's not moving very fast. Meanwhile, Homer has painted the crows in an immediate foreground, that is to say, not only above the fox, but closer to us. And what that change of scale does, of course, is make the crows look like great hawks or eagles or vultures, and of course, symbolically, they're black. And they are now eyeing the fox below. You also have, and some historians have pointed out, that this particular kind of winter berry is poisonous. It's the only touch of red, i.e. blood, in the picture. So Homer, I think, for the first time has introduced the idea of life and death hanging in the balance. And as I said, kind of Darwinian reversal. The fox, which would have had control of animal life around here, is now about to become, one presumes, the victim or be attacked itself. And so the immobility, the change of scale here, so that these birds are literally larger on the canvas surface than the fox, or at least are equal in size. Homer's clearly playing with something here. But it is the signature that is almost startling in both its technical expertise as well as, I want to argue, its significance. And I think you can just make it out here in the lower left foreground. Just below it is 94 for the date of the painting, 1894. And I think it's not too much to see, or at least to think, and I will describe it, because quite stunningly, he has painted the signature so that it too is half sunken into the snow. Secondly, he has painted the W so that the bar of the W projects forward, that is to say, to the left. And I think you can make out that the R curves way down of the tail, emulating the fox. The outstretched paw of the W, the curving tail of the R. And as I think you can see, or certainly make out, it is the same reddish-brown paint of the fox itself. All right, so what does this tell you? It's on the first level, the easy one to accept, is that Homer is in some way associating himself with the fox's predicament. The fox, can I use the term, as potential victim. Well, there were two main categories of citizens then and now who were in a sense victimized or thought of themselves as victims. One were homosexuals, two were blacks in America at this time. Here's the speculation. I have to wonder, or just want to pose this and we'll go on. Was Homer somehow had repressed attractions to both of these? I just throw that out to hang in the balance, particularly given the trajectory we've gone. But let me pursue it one step further. This great painting, which comes at the end of his career, 1900, at the end of the decade, in the Met. We all know it, the Gulf Stream, one of his great, great masterpieces, certainly in the history of American art, set in the Caribbean. The title itself is already interesting because there's no location here except for the violent separation between warm and cold water from the Caribbean coming up the East Coast. And because of that violent contrast of temperatures, a spawning ground, as we know, for hurricanes, and here in the background, a water spout, a waterborne tornado. So the title sets you out in the open water. There's no reference to land, so there's a kind of particular isolation here. I will say, this is not a picture that's signed, but I'll come back to what I think it meant to Homer. It's a painting I think you can read on a number of levels. First, let's just take as I say, 1900. Let's take this on a national level. Well, first, in 1895, I believe, and I've got two Boston Museum trustees here, but I believe it was in 1895 that the Boston Museum acquired the first painting by Turner to come to this country. It's the great masterpiece by Turner from the 1840s called The Slave Ship. So, and it comes to Boston. Homer was in and out of Boston, back and forth from Prout's Neck. He almost certainly saw this dramatic picture and somehow responded to it. He waits for 4 or 5 years to do anything about it, but the great Turner painting has swirls of turbulent sun and water, with the slaves being thrown overboard. Again, it was a sensation when it got to Boston for this almost abstracted drama that still was legible of, as I say, life and death taking place. And so Homer's painting, whatever indebtedness is to to Turner, is surely about, on one level of reference, to the slave trade, which of course was anchored in the Caribbean, between Africa, the Caribbean, and New England, and then back to England. And it involved slaves for sugar and other goods to complete the circle of trade going on. So I think Homer is probably thinking about this in artistic terms, but is immediately linking it, I think, to the state of race in America at this time. With the failure of Reconstruction in the 1870s and 80s, a new virulent racism begins to emerge in American life by the last decade of the century. Certainly in New England, he would have been aware of it. It was in the culture. So this subtle referencing, I think, of the Caribbean slave trade is in the background. It also reminds us that at this very moment with Teddy Roosevelt et al. And followers. This is the first moment when America really becomes an imperial power and starts either to intrude in other nations or occupy them. So we have, in a sense, our intrusion into the Caribbean with the acquisition of Puerto Rico, the occupation of Dominica and Haiti, and then, of course, Panama, and ultimately the Philippines. In a sense, this intrusion into the third world of darker-skinned natives. I think, to me, that also rings a bell of a layered, meaning here. There's the new racism, there's American imperialism, there is the black now. And what do we have but an extraordinarily muscular figure who sure doesn't look, I mean, we're meant to see him as caught between life and death here, but full of, physicality. Again, I find that quite interesting. There's another level here. I won't say that Homer was a religious artist or even a spiritual one, but there, I think, and others have pointed this out, I think there are biblical overtones here. That is to say, and of course, just to talk for a moment about, salvation and the next life and death held up here. In the background, of course, there's the great three masters sailing on the horizon that because of the turbulence of the waves and the trough here, cannot see and therefore cannot rescue this wrecked vessel with the black aboard. He turns, of course, and looks towards the waterspout, which we presume will overtake him in the foreground. It reminds me of the wonderful letter that I've forgotten who the Boston lady was who wrote Homer after seeing this picture and said, "Oh, dear Mr. Homer, whatever is going to happen to that poor black man?" And Homer clearly was annoyed that somehow wanted a narrative here, wrote back and said to the effect, "Oh, my dear whoever, 3 days later he was rescued and survived and went on to live a happy life." Clearly hadn't got the deep resonance of human meaning here. Now, when I say biblical, a couple of things. And you can see, maybe Copley's Watson and the Shark, another painting he would have known from the Boston Museum collection, may account for the sharks. Blood in the water. Very few. When red appears in Homer, it's pretty significant. So we have blood in the water, the shark circling. Clearly he's been broiled for several days. The mast is broken. First significant detail. The broken mast was often used in cemeteries as a neoclassical column, broken, symbolically, of course, a life ended. So it has this funereal aspect. Secondly, some have pointed out the very large cabin, open cabin, black inside. A cabin that seems to be much too wide for being safe in open seas. One historian's gone so far, and as I say, this is cumulative, has gone so far that this is a kind of reference to Christ's tomb. After 3 days, rises from the tomb, opens it, and leaves. Thirdly, there are all these roiling forms that are meant to be sugar cane, so again, the sugar trade. But I also can't help but read those coiled forms as snakes in the Garden of Eden. So whether you buy that or not, you put those pieces together along with another prominent detail. It's a little hard to read, but right forward of the broken mast, you can make out in the original a very large cleat in the shape of a cross. So there's something there. I can't pursue it further, but I throw that level out. And then finally, there's the personal level. If there is this repressed attraction to black male flesh, this would be one aspect of it. But the other probably crucial thing that triggered going to this subject matter was the death of Homer's father the year before. This meditation on the passage of time and death itself. We'll see another example in a moment of a critical picture he did after his mother's death 15 years earlier. But and Homer, unmarried, lives with his mother and father until their deaths, I think was deeply moved and deeply upset by their respective passing. So this picture can be read as a kind of memorial. Finally, it's also a painting, painted in that year of the new century, of the fearfulness Americans generally felt, as we did in 2000, of the passing of a century, a new world, of course, filled with immigrants flooding the American cities. I mean, boy, this sounds familiar today. And so I just throw all of this out because I think cumulatively a lot of things are at work and begin to explain its great power. Finally, the comparison shows you an extraordinary photograph of Homer standing in front of this very painting. To my knowledge, there are only about maybe a dozen, at the most 24 photographs of Homer and his family taken. I can only think of really half a dozen photographs of him as opposed to him and his father together, etc., on the Prout's Neck's Rock. So already it's a rare phenomenon. It becomes even more rare in that this is the only photograph taken of him with a work of art, and it is the Gulf Stream. All right, speculation. Did he want to stand next to this picture so that, in a sense, his standing vertical form allies with the silhouetted form of the black in the boat? We have no idea of the circumstances of the photo, except that it was taken by his brother Charles in the studio. Did Homer say, I'm finishing this picture, take my photograph in it? Did Charles walk in with a camera and he happened to be where? Nobody can answer that question, except the bottom line is that somehow, either consciously or intuitively, he wanted to be photographed with this picture, and whatever association he may have had with the internal subject matter. So let us move also back to the late 1890s, a few years before. A couple of, to me, extraordinary watercolors on this very theme. The Bahamian conch fisherman. It's interesting, when he goes to the Bahamas, to the Florida Keys, women he will paint clothed, carrying baskets of flowers, absolutely beautiful watercolors. He does not paint the black males as street vendors or as tourists or anything else. He paints black male flesh in all of its glistening muscularity. And if you look at that, look at that signature, it's really visible. The two bars at the H stick forward, both like the turtle, and the black man's right arm sticking forward. And here's again that curving R that emulates and copies the extended leg of the running figure on the beach above. Pretty clear association between the two, however much of a reading you accept. And even more daring in a way, and quite witty. Here you have a figure, the turtle pound, pulling a turtle, clearly standing in waist-length water. Another figure looking, whereas the signature right over there, painted in the same brown pigment as the black skin. And also, if you can make it out, like the fox hunt, the signature is half above water and half below water, like the standing figure. All right, finally, let me just come at this another way, because it's not an axe to grind. I began to see these things and want to throw them out. And the other way is to realize that as you go through Homer's entire career, while he had no hesitation painting girls or young women, and painted them beautifully throughout most of his career, the solidity of the human figure. The fact is that in almost all the paintings where men and women are together, Homer's figures never touch. They are separated. So you have to ask, how much is that conscious? How much is that just an intuitive kind of thing? Now, in these early pictures, which again take us back to the 1870s, one called the Temperance Meeting, the farm ewes crossing on the pathway here, presumably one going uphill, the other turning to come down. They meet, but they do not touch or really interact. She's staring at the ground. He's engaged in, in a sense, almost looking over her shoulder. And that's repeated by the pairings above, the two open doorways into the barn, the two different colored barns, the two cows on the hillside. All of his pairings are separated. And then there's this wonderfully coy, again, more genre-like picture called Milking Time, where you have the young man and the young woman looking at each other, and of course massaging the teats of the cow's udder, kind of surrogate sexuality, if you want. But critically, and he must have intended this, there is space between them. So I find that an interesting theme, which brings us to this great painting, and I'm moving back and forth in time. 1885, The Lifeline in the Philadelphia Museum. The first thing I'll say about it is, like the Gulf Stream painted after his father's death, this was painted directly after his mother's death. And as you look closely at it, you might say, oh, male and female are touching. They're even in an embrace in this picture. But look closely. Because it's very ambiguous and very complicated. And when I say complicated, she appears to have become unconscious, to have passed out. But that head thrown back in a kind of exhaustion, you might argue, is a kind of post-coital, post-sexual posture, like Bernini's Saint Teresa. Secondly, she's not unconscious totally, because if you again look closely, here is her arm, her left arm. This one is hanging limp. This arm is physically reaching up to grab the ropes of the bosun's chair, which is carrying the figure from the wrecked vessel to the shoreline. Their figures watching this dramatic event take place halfway between the wrecked vessel and safety on the land. So again, Homer has set up this theme of life and death and the balance. We know they're halfway across, not just because they're in the middle of the composition, but there are dots of flecks of water, moisture on the rope on this side, whereas on this side they are not, indicating that the pulley has moved across and removed or squeezed all the water out. Again, just a subtle detail. To give you details that other historians have pointed out, the great plume of water, is it fair to use the phrase, the adjective ejaculatory? The pulley itself could be read as a death's head. There are no letters. Homer didn't explain these things. But as I say, it's part of the great thematic exploration of the human condition that Homer was interested in, but particularly on this question of male and female interlocking. The greatest irony here, and of course the blood red of her scarf fluttering across his face, obscuring the rescuer, turning him anonymous or universal, whether again it's blood, it's certainly another death signifier. And of course, he does have his waist around her. There's also something almost sexual about his right arm, which reaches in, and you can see the thumb underneath her armpit. So there is one bit of pressure of flesh. But the key area of, talk about ambiguity, the key area of intersection, as it were, between the crotch areas of male and female are separated by a life preserver, a kind of chastity belt, if you want. So this is a picture about great things, but I think it's also about sexual frustration. And what that has to do with the mother, I leave to Freudians. The other major picture of the 1880s, Saved, as you see here, too muscular now, and it's as close as Homer ever comes to painting the nude, are males, the white and the blacks that we've just seen. Here rescuing two women. The women are in an interlocked embrace, and we can't tell, again, whether they're dead or alive. The man in the foreground has brought them in and turns away. This man barely has a hold of clothing and also turns away. So one has to look at, as I say, what Homer meant by that charged imagery. Which brings me to his two last pictures. And I should say, I repeat, the Gulf Stream was not signed, but as I said, that photograph with him, in a sense, clearly indicates his association with that picture. Slightly different angle here of interpretation. That is to say, Homer will die in 1910, probably of heart failure. About 1906, the time of this painting on the left in the National Gallery, called Right and Left, he began to have his first mini strokes or mini heart attacks, first disabling. He knew by this time about his own, not imminent, but near mortality. So these themes he was playing with now become extremely, I think, personal. And in Right and Left, you have a remarkable picture. He himself titled. It went to his dealer, Nerdler's in New York, and he came in to see the picture hanging in the gallery. And I think a potential client, asked him what the title was. And he said, Right and Left, referring, of course, to two shots, one out of each barrel of a shotgun, which you can barely make out in the background there. There's not only a puff of smoke, there's a flash of orange indicating that the shot has just gone off. So Right and Left, killing two birds, presumably with two shots. And yet, are two birds killed? I've ruminated, and I should say, we don't have an answer to this. It could be three possibilities. It could be, or two. It could be the first shot. It could be the second shot. If it's the first shot, which I think it is, and you could argue which bird is alive. Duck professionals would tell you that when danger occurs, they will dive for the water. Others will tell you that that bird on the right diving in the water is one that clearly has been hit. Others will say the duck will flee upwards. So one reading could be that the one on the right has been shot, that the second barrel, still to come, will get the one on the left. Maybe in the end it doesn't matter, and Homer leaves it ambiguous. It could be the second shot, one killed, the other about to be killed instantaneously. Because with the puff of the flame, it is an instant, not a second, it is an instant between being alive and being killed. Now, when I say being killed, think about this. Sporting pictures that you know, never in the history of art that I know of has this perspective ever been taken by an artist. Typical hunting pictures will show maybe the hunter from behind, and you look out over the flight of birds in the distance. Or more conventionally, you'll see the hunter lifting a rifle or a shotgun, and the birds are off to the right or the left. But here, and again, think about this as one of his final paintings, he has the shotgun fired not just at the birds, but at us and Homer himself. I find that extraordinary. And it's one of the reasons why this is such a deeply moving and, in a way, disturbing picture. I'm not sure that I would use the adjective suicidal, but it surely is a painting about the consciousness of death on the literally on the horizon. And that play, even the fact that the horizon has disappeared, he's allowed the fog to obscure the horizon. So again, you're in this isolated space like the Gulf Stream of total isolation. Now, there were a number of artistic sources for this, and of course, once you cite them, it's what Homer has done with them. They're Japanese prints of birds and trees, often paired, one flying, one sitting, one going up, one going to, you can almost find an exact Hiroshige or Hokusai to match this up. Secondly, contemporary photography. Homer knew the photography of animal locomotion being undertaken at the University of Pennsylvania by Edward Muybridge and Thomas Akins, showing photographs, multiple stopped action of human figures running, animals, birds in flight. The whole idea of the stopped action of the bird is photographic. Just to throw out, it's not that it's a conscious image. This is the moment of the Wright brothers lifting off the Earth for the first time, 2 years before, December 1904. And once you're in the air, you know, up and down, left and right changes. You're looking down at the Earth. So the whole idea of the obscurity, this is a very modern picture, not just painted in the 20th century, but modern in its thinking. And so I think it's at the very least, and finally, there's an Audubon print of the Golden Eye Ducks, which Homer explicitly borrowed from. So you have kind of scientific, artistic traditions here, which he has absorbed into this masterpiece. And as I say, with the placement of the hunter there in the background, turns the whole thing on its ear into something far more powerful, and as I would argue, far more personal. And finally, his last painting, the year before he died, such a poignant picture, I think, 1906, now in the Boston Museum, called Weather Beaten. And as you see, you have a figure here who's come down to the water's edge, who is almost certainly Homer himself, his familiar sou'wester, has come down wanting to paint his great subject matter, the ocean, the rocks at Prout's Neck. We know exactly what little inlet there that was painted below his studio. And what do we have in the foreground, which gives it its title? A great, huge tree that has been floating for a long time and is now washed up and lodged itself in the rocks in front of him. And so, talk about the ultimate frustration. The great subject matter which he comes down to look at is now physically and, in a sense, psychologically inaccessible. He is barred from it. I think it's almost a tragic and elegiac picture. So, final sentence. Whatever Homer's sexual and psychological profile is, and you know, we can play with that or think about that. In some sense, Homer was right. He said to his first biographer, William Howe Downes, who published a year after he died, came to Homer to interview him, and Homer said, "My life is of no consequence to others." In effect, some of the effect, "My life is in my art." That challenging sentence has haunted all of us who've worked on Homer ever since. It's one of the challenges why you want to probe the life in the art. I said it was the last sentence, several semicolons in there. So whatever his proclivities were, the real fact of the matter is, I won't say they had nothing to do, but in a sense, they pale before the grandeur of an artist who painted some of the greatest masterpieces in the history of American art. Thank you.